So we heard here other ideas to see from Dave Jenkins. So thank you to be with us and give us EPCs in Europe, how much to harmonize?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dave Jenkins from Heriot-Watt University. My presentation is about to appear, I hope. I was also going to be joined by my researcher, Maza Saifika, who's maybe online. Unfortunately, the Belgian embassy didn't agree with her visa application, so she's not able to be here in person today. If anyone has any good contacts in the Belgian embassy, then do let me know. That'd be useful. Okay, so while that's coming up, brilliant. Great. Yeah, so I think we understand. We mentioned harmonization a couple of times already today. So I think we know that the EPBD doesn't enforce all EPCs to be absolutely identical. We know there's some variation there. But before we push for harmonization, we need to understand what we mean by harmonization, first of all, because different people have different understandings of where the EPC starts and finishes. Where do we already have it? Why do we want it? What's the driver behind harmonization? Just making things the same in itself isn't a good thing. There needs to be a reason why we want things to be the same. And how could this be implemented? So particularly when we start thinking about to what degree this is an achievable goal, we know all the countries involved with EPCs, they have different building stocks, different climates, different technologies that are at different stages in the market within those countries. And also the more complicated cultural relationship that we have with our buildings between the occupants and the buildings themselves. Is it a heating dominated climate? Is it a cooling dominated climate? And so on. So we accept these are all differences. So do they provide hurdles to harmonization, and what do we need to think about? So in terms of what harmonization actually is, it could be many things. It could just be about the EPC ratings themselves and those main metrics that we're all familiar with on an EPC document. It could be all the metrics and indicators that we might want to use within EPCs, and particularly with reference to next generation metrics. Is that the thing that we're trying to harmonize so that these all are the same across Europe? Is it the entire EPC journey? So is it the inputs, the calculations, the outputs? And it's at this stage that you really need to get into the detail of an EPC methodology to understand these differences. And I'll touch on that in a second. Is it the assessment protocols, the actual site visits, if they exist, or the assessor training? Every country has a slightly different group of EPC assessors in terms of their background and who they are. Does that need to be harmonized? Or is it the policy implementation? Are we just concerned with how these EPC ratings are used within local policy? Or is it absolutely everything, all of the above? And my opinion, there would be, I hope not. I've been censored. So let's drill down exactly what we're trying to harmonize and to what extent these things might work. So first of all, what baseline are we working from? We're talking about next generation metrics and innovations and so on, but let's understand what our baseline currently is in terms of how different we are. So crossCerts, we've tried to understand this by looking at layers and layers of detail within the EPCs. So first of all, the aesthetics of the EPC documentation, we know these are somewhat different. There's common indicators, common graphics even that are sometimes used in EPCs, but we also know there are differences. The calculation approaches, I mean, and this is sometimes the calculation approach is glossed over a little bit because it's maths and physics, and it's the real detail of those engines that are behind the EPCs, and you don't see any of that when you look at an EPC. But several projects and several people in the room will be well aware of the difference in calculation approaches across the different European countries. And the definitions and terminology and the inputs, outputs that are used, whether it's some countries prefer using primary energy, some prefer using end use, sort of final energy consumption. The communication of the energy efficiency improvements is something we've looked at a lot. So the way we tell the building owner what they might want to do with their building is really very different across different EPCs. The EPC assessor practices and trainings and skills, I'll mention that in a minute, but we know EPC assessors are different as we go from country to country. And when it comes to harmonization, this is a key barrier that we need to consider. And then taking a step back from some of those issues, thinking of verification and validation frameworks. So this is really about, first of all, understanding what categories should be used to compare EPCs, and I'll mention that a little bit later on. What kind of indicators are we using to test our similarities and our differences? And then also around validation frameworks, so quality control. Is it possible to harmonize a quality control mechanism that works for most EPCs? So yes, EPCs are different, and I mean, people in the room will be familiar with some of these. So we know that there are indicators and graphics and outputs that are common across EPCs, but actually they do look almost remarkably different when you start to put all these things together. And it's not just the color scheme or the graphics. It is actually the content is often really quite different as well. But maybe that's not a bad thing. I'm not suggesting any of these differences are wrong and we should fix them, but they exist and we should be aware of that. So what we tried to do is get into the detail of these methodologies. And first of all, this is kind of a spectrum of standardization. So we looked at the cross-cert partner countries, and we looked at how tailored and how standardized the different EPC methodologies were. So first of all, in terms of the calculation methodology, in the case of the UK, we're fairly standardized in terms of the options we're given, what we're given the assessor to do. The judgments that the assessor has to make are kind of reduced because there's a fairly set list of instructions, whether it's a U value that you should use for a building of a certain age or the efficiency of a heating system. That's pretty controlled. You've got very tight, limited advice as a UK EPC assessor, whereas in somewhere like Bulgaria, the energy assessor is able to apply their knowledge and judgment a bit more. And again, I'm not suggesting which end of that spectrum is best, but they are different, and we should recognize that. We also took a similar approach to looking at the recommendations. So the energy efficiency recommendations in the EPCs, they're not the same. Again, in the UK, I feel comfortable talking about the UK. I'm allowed to be critical about the UK assessments without anybody attacking me afterwards. But the UK energy efficiency recommendations are fairly copy and paste. There's recognizable text in the recommendations box, cavity wall insulation, condensing boiler, etc. You know, it's familiar, and again, that could be a good thing. There are benefits to that. Whereas in some of our other countries on the other side of the spectrum, it's almost kind of open text, free flow text that the assessor has put in there to try to describe that measure. So, you know, again, thinking of harmonization, it's very difficult to harmonize those two very different views, those two different approaches to recommendations. And then we took that a little bit further by looking at the assessors themselves. So we tried to make a judgment, and it is a judgment, so it is open for debate, as to how kind of qualified energy assessors are. So both their education background and the training procedure they have to go through to become an EPC assessor in that country. And again, we've got a kind of spectrum there from a low requirement and high requirement. This isn't a judgment of the average competencies of an EPC assessor. This is the minimum requirement. And all our methodologies are supposed to be trained on the minimum requirement. We're not, you know, it could be that the average assessor is a lot more qualified than that minimum, but we do need to understand what that minimum is. That's what we've been working on. And so we tried to, and this is in a cross-cert deliverable report, so I'm not going to go into the detail of this. Go onto our website and you'll see the background to this work. But we tried to plot the level of assessor training. So we tried to score the level of assessor training against the level of complexity of the assessment, just through cross-cert partner countries. It would be really nice to populate this graph with all countries in the EU, or not in the EU in the case of UK. But in doing so, we're able to see some kind of correlation between the requirement for education background and training of the assessors and the level of complexity of the assessment. What's the assessor having to do as part of that assessment? What knowledge are they having to apply? So again, in the case of Bulgaria, you've got reasonably high minimum threshold of qualifications, and you've also got quite a complex assessment. So that kind of makes sense. And again, you can make a judgment as to what point of that graph is the right balance between complexity and training. But again, we're just trying to point out the differences of that. So it's unlikely that you'll be able to accommodate new EPC metrics in the same way. You couldn't take the Bulgarian method and ask UK and Austrian EPC assessors to just apply that method, because these are fundamentally differently trained EPC assessors. They're different types of practitioners. The training of those practitioners have been developed on the type of assessment that it's assumed they will be carried out. So you can't just enforce harmonization on those groups of individuals. Moving over to verification framework. So this is what mechanisms are in place in different countries to ensure quality control or to improve quality control. So we've listed all these, and there's different approaches, again, differences in different countries. Some countries have verification rules in the EPC software, so you get quite an early red flag if you've put some numbers in that don't quite make sense. Some countries have automatic verification rules embedded in their online EPC registers. So it's a little bit further on the path, but there is a kind of error warning that pops up when that gets registered online. Some countries then have independent checks by official government bodies or third-party organizations where they might take a sample of EPC assessments and check that they've been done appropriately, and then use that as an indicator that things are right or things are wrong. And some countries will have a combination of those three options. And so the question we're trying to ask is there a connection between the complexity and standardization of the calculation methodology and the quality control mechanism? Because that intuition would say there probably is, because if you've got a very standardized control assessment, then it's relatively straightforward to put a quality control mechanism in place because you've already tightened the procedure. You've already limited the inputs that are possible for that assessment. If you've got a broader, if you've given the EPC assessor more things that they can do, it's a bit more difficult to run an automatic quality control mechanism, we would suggest. So there is a link, we think, between the standardization level of the EPC assessment methodology and the quality control mechanism that's put in place. So again, you can't just take a harmonized quality control mechanism and apply it to all EPC assessments on that level. Don't worry if you can't read this table. This is also, like all these outputs, they're in our deliverable reports, which you can get on the website. But this is just trying to list those different forms of quality control across the different partner countries. And we've compared it to how standardized we think the assessment process is. And we've made some judgment on that. So why is this one important for next generation EPCs? Well, the process for applying next generation EPC metrics and innovations are going to be different for different countries. And I think it's not just crossCert. I think a number of other projects have done a really good job in sort of quantifying and qualifying the differences between EPCs in different countries. But there's sometimes a tendency, I think, to say, okay, they're different, but let's just carry on anyway. Let's imagine that there's some kind of unified European EPC framework. And then when we bring in innovations and next generation metrics, let's just assume these can all be applied in the same way for all these different EPCs. And that's just not true. We need to understand, take time looking at the detail of these EPCs to understand why that might be true. And as I say, there's a number of projects that I think have done a really good job in trying to describe this. Some new metrics may not even be suitable for a given EPC approach. We have to be open to that idea. But it's not just about a kind of overview of the assessment. It also involves considering the assessor as well as part of that consideration. This point's been made many times before, but we need to guard against EPCs being asked to do things that they were not ever intended to do. But the extra layer of complication on that is that assessment isn't the same in every country. So in some countries, this new ask of an EPC might actually work quite well. It fits in really well with that country's EPC approach. It doesn't work for another country. So should we actually focus the harmonization on how we use and verify EPCs rather than the EPCs themselves? Should we just accept that EPCs are going to be different in different countries? We need to bring it back to the EPBD and have some kind of framework in place to ensure that those EPCs are being used in the right way. And that's where the harmonization comes in. It's a harmonized check, a harmonized critique, rather than being overly harmonized in the EPCs that we use. And just to give you an example of what that sort of checking procedure might look like, this is from some previously published work. That's an academic paper that I've linked at the bottom of the slide. What we were trying to do here is to think about, let's imagine we've got all these several different columns of different EPC approaches. This happens to relate to the calculation procedure, but actually these could just be EPC approaches of every country in Europe, or even next generation approaches as well. Under what criteria should we critique them? Should we try to understand what they do? That helps us then compare across countries and actually illustrate the lack of harmonization across these different approaches. In this paper, so as I say, these could be different EPC methods. In this paper, we chose 6 criteria over which we can consider these different EPC methods. Alignment with reality, flexible demand rating, which is part of the SRI, but is a common theme that comes up from our energy modeling work. Does it accommodate new technology? Is it suitable for punitive action? And can you actually, is it robust enough that you could actually enforce and ask somebody to do something as a mandatory piece of advice? Extrapolation and standardization obviously is key for EPCs. It needs to work for millions of buildings. How does that work? It's interesting when you increase the level of complexity of the calculation, potentially seesaw kind of goes the other way in terms of how easy it is to extrapolate and standardize. And then the quality of input information as well. But we could discuss a different list of criteria here, but having a framework in place where lots of different EPC methods could be judged under a standardized, harmonized way. So just to finish off, there is a need to accept some of our differences where they are required. That sounds like just some general advice across everything. But for EPCs, we need to just understand those differences exist across our assessments. And EPCs can give this illusion of harmonization because we think of these A to G ratings, we think of the common metrics that we often use. But actually, when you get under the bonnet, I mean, sometimes it's the difference between a Formula One car and a bus. They both have wheels, they both have engines, but actually what's going on underneath that engine are really quite different. So those differences are hidden, but we need to do the level of analysis that many of our projects are trying to do to understand that. But we can potentially cluster EPC approaches. We don't necessarily need to think of applying next generation metrics to 28 different EPC methodologies. There are similarities and almost clusters of EPC approaches, complex ones, simple ones, and different levels of assessor training. So if we can group and cluster that, maybe the advice and our attempts to implement change into EPCs becomes a little bit more efficient. Harmonization is not an end goal in itself, as I say, but it may reduce effectiveness. It may, on the negative side, it may reduce effectiveness for an individual country if you enforce change just for the purposes of harmonization. But clearly, if we're trying to make sure that EPBD changes are mapping across to individual countries, harmonization could help us do that in a more effective way and sharing the best practice. And this isn't just a next generation EPC issue. Clearly, but if we ignore the current variations in EPC frameworks, then we're likely to restrict the effectiveness of new uses of EPCs. We need to understand the baseline we've got. When we identify those differences, we shouldn't just ignore them and move on to next generation EPCs. We should think about, right, well, how do you make these innovations to these specific countries have somewhat different ways of approaching EPC assessments? And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, David, for giving that overview and reminding us also of the goal of harmonization, what we harmonize and so on. And now we come to Sarah Noyer from Technalia with a promised talk about the deep dive into the key exploitable results of the EPC RECAST project.